This presentation, titled US FDA versus ISO requirements, comes to us from Jose Sabal. Jose is a consultant, internal auditor, and trainer for the food and beverage industry worldwide, providing solutions for improving process efficiency, including effective training, verification, and validation of food safety and quality systems for more than 25 years. He is the president and director of Sabal Food Safety Consulting, a company dedicated to supporting companies worldwide on compliance with legal and regulatory requirements, as well as compliance with the requirements of voluntary food safety standards, like those benchmarked against GFSI, which is SQF, BRC, FSSC 22000, and other schemes focused on the preservation of the identity of certain food ingredients, such as gluten-free, non-GMO, organic or sustainable seafood, MCS, and ASC. And with that, take it away, Jose.
Okay, good morning, Mike, and good morning, everyone watching at this presentation. It's a very short presentation, and it's just about showing you in systems which are the differences between the requirements and how that may impact the development and implementation of your food safety systems. So like Mike was saying, my company is located in the United States, in Florida, and we do help people developing these food safety systems and programs, including food defense, food fraud, HACCP implementation, and I will say better using the HACCP principle for the implementation of the necessary controls. So I would like to start the presentation by having a few definitions that will be very important in our presentation today, in our session today. These definitions are taken from the ISO vocabulary. So this is formal definitions of these terms. So a system, which is what we are supposed to be developing under any of the requirements worldwide, basically, and including the United States. A system is, and I'm reading right now, a set of interrelated and interacting elements. Those elements are basically the ones that your programs and your procedures, the ones you are developing in order to comply with the requirements applicable to your own specific activities and processes. The next definition is the definition of a requirement, and is a need or expectation. So US FDA, as well as the ISO standards, they do require that we follow certain things, that we do certain things. In our case specifically is to maintain sanitary conditions or to develop procedures that will be taking care of specific hazards. The next definition here is the definition of a management system. And management system is, again, a set of interrelated and interacting elements, which is exactly what we're supposed to have as a system. But now that system is focused, is dedicated to the organization, to the products that we're making, to the processes that we're following, and to any other activity that will be required based on regulations or based on the voluntary requirements that we are following. The last definition here is, and this is very simple, is the USDA is the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. So, which are the requirements under US FDA regulations? Laws and regulations are mandatory in each and every single country in the world. In the United States, for most of the food, the regulations are coming from the FDA. Certain meats, poultry, and egg products, and a species of fish that is called siluriforms, they are regulated by the Food Safety Inspection Service of the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, but everything else, including drugs and tobacco and cosmetics and food, of course, those are regulated by the FDA in the United States. And the thing here is that domestic or foreign processing facilities, if they want to sell their products in the United States, they need to be in compliance with these regulations here. So most likely those companies will have more requirements in their systems because they will need to be in compliance with the requirements, the legal requirements, legal and regulatory requirements of the country of manufacture, legal and regulatory requirements of the FDA, which is the country of sale. And then if these companies are following any of the GFSI standards or the ISO standards, that management system is going to also include all the requirements of the ISO program. In the United States, there are many different regulations depending on products and processes, but after the last Modernization Act that was passed as law in 2011, the regulation applicable to the most typical regulation for the manufacturing of food products will be 21 CFR 117. Now, this regulation in subpart B, we have the good manufacturing practices. These good manufacturing practices were previously located in a different regulation. It was a different number. Well, they were moved and located within this new regulation in subpart B. And food facilities must develop and implement their food safety systems, which is a requirement by the FDA. FDA indicates that the person that is the most responsible for developing and implementing these programs, these systems, is the preventive controls qualified individual, and it's a person that is knowledgeable about the regulations. So this person is supposed to be using the 7 principles. They are not called 7 principles in the regulation. They are called management components. But if we actually analyze the intent in those management components, it is possible that we can match and identify that the 7 principles of the HACCP technique are there. So the last bullet point here, whenever a hazard that may cause illness or injury is identified in our hazard analysis, the food safety plan must include preventive controls. And the purpose of these preventive controls is to prevent or minimize the occurrence of these hazards. So look at one of the differences that you may see already between ISO, which is GFSI, well, not ISO, FSSC 22000 is using the ISO standards, and that one is the one that is recognized by GFSI, benchmarked. And as you can see, if we use the HACCP technique, the HACCP technique requires that we do something in a step of the flow chart, in one step of our flow of the products in our process, in order to control the hazard. So the definition of a critical control point is linking already a control measure to a step of the process. In the case of the preventive controls, that is not happening. A preventive control is defined just as a measure that is going to be put in place in order to take care of a hazard. It doesn't matter if it's linked to a step in the flowchart, step in the process, or to any other area of the GNPs. And that's how it is defined in the regulation. So again, this new approach is the outcome of the Food Safety Modernization Act. It's a law that was passed in 2011. And there was a change in a lot of other regulations because of that FSMA approach. So now let's move to the ISO requirements now. So ISO requirements are specifically used in the FSSC 22000. FSSC 22000 is a combination of ISO 22000, and the most current version of this standard is the 2018 version. And the ISO 22000 is going to be used for, number one, the management components of that system. And number two, because under ISO 22000 is going to be required that we use the HACCP approach, the HACCP technique approach, which is the same 7 principles that are used as management components in FDA. And for the GMPs in the FDA is in subpart B of the regulation. But the GMPs for the ISO program are coming in the ISO TS 22002-, and there are some numbers, if I'm not wrong, from 1 to 6, depending on the specific products that are being manufactured. So if you're making food for humans, you will need to follow 22002-1. If you're making food for animals, it will be 22002-6, and so on. There is one for packaging material, one for retail, and so on. There is a specific standard for the GMPs according to the activities and the products performed by the company. So besides the ISO 22000, there are other schemes that are benchmarked against the Global Food Safety Initiative, okay? Global Food Safety Initiative is the one that basically approves the standards, the schemes that will be used worldwide to be accepted worldwide. And those ISO requirements are more or less standard, even though that is not mentioned in those standards that they are, that they're following ISO structures. So basically, what I'm going to start doing here is try to draw a little bit of some similarities between the FDA requirements, the system requirements under FDA laws and regulation, and the ISO-based standards. So they both, and this is something that you are going to see in the bullet point number 2, they both have requirements for good manufacturing practices in place. In the FDA, I will use that the most generic one will be subpart B of the regulation 21 CFR 117. And that is the most common one, and is applicable to a wide range of other processes and products. But there are other specific requirements in other regulations. And this is just as an example. If anyone is processing seafood, there is a regulation for seafood HACCP, and that regulation required the implementation of the GMPs that are spelled in the regulation for preventive controls. And then there are other requirements in that regulation that is applicable exclusively to seafood products. Same thing applies with many other regulations. And, it may come up to my mind. The milk ordinance has a specific regulation for processing milk products. The regulation for low acid canned foods, it's also applicable for any product that is packaged under hermetically sealed conditions, and so on. So it is very likely that in the processing of products that will be sold in the United States, there will be several regulations that are applicable to that system. The requirements in all of those regulations will need to be addressed in our own food safety management system. And after we have all of those GMPs, which are basically in place to maintain sanitary conditions at the facility, to control the most basic conditions for processing food, then we need to develop and implement a food safety plan, which no matter if it's FDA or ISO, those food safety systems and the implementation of the food safety plan will follow the use of the HACCP technique. And you might be curious, but I'm using the word HACCP technique because HACCP by default is a technique that we use to determine risk and then set up controls. set up some way that we are going to deal with these hazards or conditions or consequences or problems that we want to take care and make sure that they are going to be prevented or mitigated throughout the implementation of this technique. So most of the FDA and ISO based scheme requirements are very similar in intent. And actually, I will say that even the structure, I mean, separating the food safety plan from the GMPs, it's about the same in both sets of requirements, the regulatory one for the FDA and the ISO for the other one. And at the end, and this is the example that I'm showing you in this slide, developing a program or procedure for pest control has basically exactly the same intent in the ISO world that in the FDA, which is about, you know, making sure that we do have control over pest and infestation and harbors and so on at any facility that is actually processing food. So those are, I mean, kind of a wide approach of similarities. So let me now start by showing you a little bit of differences, okay? And I'm going to concentrate in potentially a little bit more detail here. So most of the differences are not from basic requirements, the intent of the GMPs, the intent of the food safety plan, and how you are going to be addressing all the requirements and the approach that you should be taking by using the HACCP technique and so on. That remains exactly the same, okay? The thing is that in the FDA requirement for GMPs, I can say that they are extremely basic. So any company that is in compliance with those basic requirements, it is very likely that will also be in compliance with any of the requirements of the ISO standard. The way that these requirements from the FDA are written are the way that the regulation is written is very broad. So there is room for interpretation, and that's when people are having trouble, because they go straight to what is written, what they are reading, and not to the intent, to what is written there. So what I'm telling everybody is that you need to read those regulations, and you need to understand that besides being in compliance with all of the requirements there, what we need to really make sure is that we understand that those are minimum requirements and that we can always go above those minimum requirements in the FDA regulations. And now, when you look in ISO, what is a prerequisite, which are those in the ISO TS 22002-X, specific to the activities of the companies? Well, some of those prerequisites goes way above and beyond what is the minimum requirement of the GMPs, okay? One very good example is not here, but I mean, I can use the hygienic zoning, which is what you have in your presentation. Hygienic zoning is not part of the FDA. Now, is it part of the ISO world? Not really, but in ISO, it is very typical that people will use that prerequisite program in order to address concerns about the sanitary conditions of the facility. And when we have different levels of hygiene throughout the different areas in the building, in the facility. Now, another one that is very interesting is that, for example, in ISO, we will need to have an approved supplier program for all of the ingredients that we're buying, and somehow approving those ingredients before they are being used in our process. Basically, if you read the requirements, the intent is to make sure that the supplier somehow has in place a food safety system that is based on GFSI. If you go there, that is basically the intent. Now, if you go to the FDA side, in FDA, unless your hazard analysis shows up or there is a hazard that is identified in your hazard analysis that may need a preventive control, a very special control, at that point is when you need to consider the use of an approved supplier. Because if that preventive control falls into the category of a supply chain, you are purchasing a product, an ingredient, I'm going to say raw material, ingredient, additive, that may potentially has a hazard that is controlled by one of your suppliers. Okay, at that point, you are going to set up a supply chain preventive control because you identified a hazard in your own hazard analysis that is controlled by your supplier. At that point, the regulation says that you need to approve your suppliers, but the approval process has very specific requirements. And again, this is the difference. The FDA says that you're supposed to be looking for the performance of that supplier against the regulations applicable to them, and making sure that you check for potential recalls, refusals of products, entry of those products into the United States, and so on. And the FDA, if I'm not wrong, since 2018, they are now sharing information about the performance of the suppliers. So at this point, the requirements under the FDA for approved suppliers and the requirements under ISO are totally different. And it's up to us to make sure that we gather the right information, the right source of information for all of those requirements, and then read them, identify what is the intent, and start working towards developing our own system to make sure that it complies with all of those requirements. So the new thing under FDA requirements is that we are supposed to develop preventive controls, and that is actually part of the name of the regulation. Within these preventive controls, we have something that is called a process preventive control, which is basically copy and paste from a CCP. So if you're working in any other country of the world besides the US, and you have a HACCP-based program system for food safety, and you do have CCPs, well, most likely you already have in place process preventive controls. But the FDA says that there are other ways to set up measures, control measures, to take care of hazards that might be happening in other areas besides the process itself. And this is the reason why there are allergen preventive controls, sanitation preventive controls, and supply chain preventive controls. Those are the new types of controls that a facility can put in place. And you will know exactly what I'm talking about when you take the preventive control for human food or for animal food regulation training. There is a training that was developed by the FDA exclusively for each and every single different type of product, like human products, food products. FISMA also modified the requirement for those companies importing food in the United States, making sure that those exporting are in compliance with US regulations. And there are some other changes for the sanitary transportation, intentional adulteration, for economic gain is addressing the human food regulation, but for intentional hazard is addressed in the intentional adulteration rule. So there are certain changes, certain things that came after FISMA, and I highly recommend that you read the regulation that could be applicable to you and get information about that. So still talking about differences, under ISO HACCP, the control measures can only be applied at any step of your process. And that is the real difference between FDA and ISO. In FDA, those controls that you put at any step of the process are called process preventive controls. In HACCP, they are called CCPs. In HACCP, by following ISO structure and using the HACCP technique under ISO, the controls that you are supposed to be putting in place fall basically under the step of the process. So for example, a sanitation preventive control could be, let's say that we are making a ready-to-eat food product that is exposed to the environment before packaging. At that point, the regulation says that it is important for anyone developing that hazard analysis to identify the adequate organism, environmental organism that could impact that food, and make sure that there is a control for that organism. Well, because it's not falling under the flow chart, it depends on the area where 1, 2, 3 more or more steps are being performed. It's about an area of the building. You will need to clean that area in a way that you are reducing the likelihood that that specific environmental pathogen may happen, okay? So that's a huge difference in approach on how you identify and control hazards between the FDA and ISO. So basically, this is going to make, if you analyze the potential difference between using the HACCP technique alone and using the preventive controls approach, is that some of these preventive controls are basically controls that we put in place because of GMPs. So now some of the GMPs, some of the prerequisite programs under ISO language will, or not will, may become preventive controls, depending on the hazard that they are controlling. Now, one thing that is very important for us to know, and I guess that I'm just lucky that I'm sharing with you this short presentation, is that very recently, the Codex Alimentarius General Principles of Food Hygiene released the last the last version of the guidance, which is a 2020 revision. And maybe because I have read the US regulation a lot, but I believe, in my opinion, that the new version of the Codex Alimentarius is trying to point in a direction that is very similar, that is quite consistent with the preventive controls approach. So I'm not surprised if in the very short future, you are going to start seeing that throughout the world, the implementation of controls will not rely only on implementation of control measures, preventive controls, not only in the steps of the process, individual steps of the process, but in any other areas of the GMPs. So as a brief conclusion to this presentation, I will say that the very important for us should be that the intent of the US FDA regulation and the ISO regulation and requirements is the same. We must take a preventive approach in nature, okay? Everything that we are doing is supposed to be, we're supposed to be looking and watching for insanitary conditions and hazards, and make sure that we do have effective controls for those conditions. We must make sure that we're always working under sanitary conditions by following the GMPs. And at the end, make sure that we develop a food safety plan that has the right controls, effective controls for all the hazards that are applicable to us. And then the other thing that I'm going to say as a conclusion is that all of the controls that we're going to have, all of the procedures to take care of all of these sanitary conditions and hazards, are basically grouped exactly the same way in the FDA and the ISO world. We have controls to maintain sanitary conditions by setting up effectively and making sure that they're working all the requirements in the GMPs. And then making sure that we have the right controls to take care of all the hazards that we identified in our hazard analysis, and that for some reason, they will belong to our food safety plan. And with that, That's the end of this presentation. If you have any question, you may scan the QR code. This is going to take you guys to the webpage of the company. And if you want to write an email, that's my email, and feel free to, contact me anytime. Thank you very much for this presentation. I appreciate the opportunity that Exemplar Global and the Food Safety Expo is giving me in sharing a little bit of this knowledge with you guys. Bye.
Well, thank you, Jose Sabal, for that look at the differences between FDA and ISO food safety requirements. And that concludes this presentation.